A black and white boy discovers a cryptic message on an old oak tree that leads him to a secret about his own origins. What he learns shocks the entire family and unites two worlds that were previously separate. What heritage was behind the mystery of the old oak tree? Find out what the boy found and how it changed everything around him. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching this video from. On the back of Jake's house stood an enormous old oak tree, its thick branches reaching out wide, casting a sprawling shadow over the entire backyard. The oak seemed almost like a guardian of the family, a witness to countless stories and generations. Jake often found himself sitting beneath it, staring up at its massive canopy, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves and dance along the ground. The bark of the tree was rough, and etched into it were carvings, names, dates, and messages left by people long before Jake was even born. Jake was a unique boy. His skin was a mix of black and white, much like his heritage. This was both his pride and his burden. Growing up, he never quite felt like he belonged anywhere. To the black kids at school, he was too light, and to the white kids, he was too dark. He existed somewhere in between, never fully accepted by either side. The oak tree became a place of solace for him, a place where he could feel at least a little bit connected to something bigger, something that had been around long before the world decided to divide people into categories. One summer afternoon, as Jake sat under the oak, he traced his fingers along the carvings on the bark. There were initials inside hearts, names with dates, and random symbols that had lost their meaning over time. But then he noticed something different, something that he had never seen before. It was an inscription, partly hidden by a thick patch of moss. Jake gently peeled away the moss, revealing the words beneath. "We can be one if we find a way to understand each other." The message struck a chord deep within Jake. It felt like the words were meant for him, like they spoke directly to the pain he had been carrying for so long. Who had carved those words, and why? Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind them, a story that might help him understand his own place in the world. He decided, right then and there, that he needed to find out more. Jake went inside and asked his mother if she knew anything about the carvings on the old oak tree. She looked up from the dishes she was washing, her expression changing as she processed his question. "The carvings," she repeated, her voice a bit hesitant. "Why are you asking about that old tree, Jake?" "There's this message," Jake said, trying to find the right words. "It says something about being one if we can understand each other. I want to know who wrote it." His mother sighed, drawing her hands on a dish towel. "That tree has been in our family for generations, Jake. A lot of people have left their marks on it, but some things are better left in the past." Jake could tell that she was uncomfortable, but he wasn't ready to let it go. He needed answers. He needed to know if there was something about that tree, about his family, that could help him understand why he always felt like he was stuck between two worlds. Later that evening, Jake decided to ask his grandmother. She was sitting in her favorite armchair knitting, her fingers moving deftly with the needles. Unlike his mother, his grandmother had always been more open about family stories, even the uncomfortable ones. "Grandma," Jake began, sitting down beside her, "do you know anything about the old oak tree in the backyard? There's this carving I found, and it sounds important." His grandmother paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. "The old oak, you say?" She set her knitting aside and took a deep breath. That tree has seen more than you could ever imagine, Jake. It's been there since before I was born, and even before your great-grandparents were born. Do you know who carved the message? Jake pressed, his curiosity growing stronger. His grandmother studied his face for a long moment before she finally nodded. I think you might be ready to hear this story, she said quietly. But you have to understand, it's not an easy one. It's about love and loss, and about the way people can be cruel when they don't understand each other. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, his eyes wide. I want to know, Grandma. Please tell me. She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting towards the window, where the old oak's branches swayed gently in the breeze. That message was carved by your great-grandfather, she began. He was a black man, a strong and passionate man who believed in equality and justice. He met a woman, a white woman named Margaret. They fell in love, but it was a love that the world wasn't ready for. Jake listened, hanging on to every word. His great-grandfather and Margaret had met in a time when the idea of a black man and a white woman being together was not just frowned upon, it was dangerous. They had to meet in secret, under the cover of night, and their love was always overshadowed by the fear of being caught. The old oak tree had been their meeting place, a place where they could be together, even if only for a few stolen moments. It was under that tree that his great-grandfather had carved those words, hoping that one day the world would change. They wanted to be together, his grandmother continued, her voice tinged with sadness. But the pressure from both of their families, from society, it was too much. They had to let each other go. But they never stopped loving each other, Jake. That tree is a reminder of what they went through, of the love they shared despite everything. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He could almost picture it. His great-grandfather and Margaret sitting beneath the oak, carving those words into the bark as a promise to each other and perhaps as a message to future generations. It was a story of love, but also of heartbreak, and it made Jake think about his own struggles in a new light. Why didn't anyone ever tell me this before? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it's painful, Jake, his grandmother replied. People don't like to remember the times when they were powerless, when they were forced to give up on something or someone they loved. But I think it's important for you to know. You are the result of so many sacrifices, of so much love that had to be hidden. You carry that history with you, and maybe, just maybe, you can help change things. Jake nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness for the love his great-grandfather had lost, anger at the injustices they had faced, but also a sense of purpose. He knew now that he couldn't just let this story fade into the past. He had to do something with it, to honor the love that had been carved into that old oak tree. That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about the message on the tree, about his great-grandfather and Margaret, and about his own life. He realized that he had a chance to be the bridge that his great-grandfather had hoped for, a bridge between two worlds that had always been kept apart. He didn't know exactly how he was going to do it, but he knew he had to try. The next morning, Jake made a decision. He was going to find out more, not just about his great-grandfather and Margaret, but about the history of both sides of his family. He was going to uncover the secrets that had been buried for too long, and he was going to find a way to bring people together, just like the message on the tree had said. With a renewed sense of determination, Jake walked out to the backyard and placed his hand on the rough bark of the old oak. We can be one, if we find a way to understand each other," he whispered, repeating the words carved into the tree. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in his life he felt like he had a purpose. He was ready to uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it might be, and to find a way to help others see what his great-grandfather had seen all those years ago, that love and understanding were the keys to overcoming the barriers that divided them. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, gently waking Jake from a restless sleep. His dreams had been filled with images of the old oak tree, of his great-grandfather and Margaret, and of words carved into the bark, echoing in his mind. He felt an overwhelming need to know more, to dig deeper into his family's past and understand the full story. His grandmother's words lingered with him, and he knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. Jake decided to start by talking to his parents again. He knew that his mother had been hesitant the last time he asked about the oak tree, but he hoped that with a bit more persistence he could get her to open up. He found her in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee, her eyes still a bit tired. "Morning, Mom," Jake greeted, trying to sound casual as he poured himself a glass of juice. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied with a smile. "You were up late last night. Everything okay?" Jake nodded, then took a deep breath. "I was just thinking about what Grandma told me, about the oak tree and great-grandpa and Margaret." His mother's smile faded slightly, and she set her mug down on the table. "Jake, I know you're curious, but some stories are they're hard to talk about. They bring up a lot of pain." She paused, her eyes distant as she remembered. He saw Margaret sitting alone, reading a book, and he went over to talk to her. They ended up talking for hours, right there in the park, while the music played and everyone else danced. They talked about books, about their dreams, about the kind of world they wanted to live in. By the time the sun had set, they knew they had found something special. Jake listened, picturing the scene in his mind: the park, the music, his great-grandfather and Margaret sitting together, oblivious to the stares and whispers around them. He could almost hear their laughter, see the way they must have looked at each other, filled with hope and possibility. "But it wasn't easy," his grandmother continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "Their families didn't approve. Margaret's parents were furious when they found out. They told her that if she continued seeing Thomas, they would disown her. And Thomas, well, his friends warned him that he was putting himself in danger. Back then, a black man being seen with a white woman could lead to violence, even death." Jake's heart ached at the thought. He had read about those times in history books, but hearing it in the context of his own family made it so much more real. It wasn't just a story. It was his legacy, a part of who he was. "They tried to keep seeing each other," his grandmother said. "They would meet in secret, late at night, under the old oak tree. It was the only place they felt safe, the only place where they could be themselves without fear. They would sit under that tree and talk, sometimes for hours, dreaming of a future where they could be together without hiding." She smiled, a bittersweet expression that made Jake's chest tighten. "That's why your great-grandfather carved that message into the tree. It was his promise to Margaret, that one day things would change, that one day they could be one, if only people could find a way to understand each other." Jake looked down at the box of letters, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the paper. Did they ever get a chance to be happy? His grandmother shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, Jake, they never did. The pressure from their families, from society, it was too much. They loved each other, but they couldn't be together. Margaret's parents forced her to marry someone else, and Thomas, he never loved anyone the way he loved her. He dedicated his life to fighting for equality, for a world where people like him and Margaret could be together without fear. But he never got to see that world. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He blinked back tears, his heart heavy with the weight of his great-grandfather's story. "It's not fair," he whispered. "They deserved better." "I know, sweetheart," his grandmother said, her voice gentle, "but their love wasn't in vain. It may not have ended the way they wanted, but it mattered. It mattered because it showed that love can exist even in the face of hatred and ignorance. And now, you know their story. You can carry it forward, share it, and maybe, just maybe, help make the world a little better." Jake nodded, wiping his eyes. He knew she was right. Thomas and Margaret's love had been real, and it had mattered. It was a part of him, a part of his family, and he was determined to honor it. He spent the rest of the afternoon with his grandmother, listening to her stories, learning more about Thomas and Margaret. She told him about the small moments they had shared, their late-night meetings, the books they exchanged, the way they would hold hands under the oak tree, even though they knew they could never be seen together in public. Each story made Jake feel closer to them, made him understand the depth of their love and the courage it had taken for them to keep seeing each other, even when the world was against them. As the sun began to set, Jake knew that his journey was far from over. He still had so much to learn, so much to uncover, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his grandmother, his family, and the legacy of Thomas and Margaret to guide him. He decided that his next step would be to share what he had learned with the rest of his family. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, just like there had been when he first asked about the oak tree. But he also knew that the truth needed to be told. It was time for his family to confront the past, to acknowledge the love that had been hidden for so long, and to find a way to move forward together. Jake looked at his grandmother, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for telling me, Grandma," he said. "I promise I won't let their story be forgotten." She smiled, reaching over to cup his cheek. "I know you won't, Jake. You have their spirit in you, and I believe that you're the one who can help bring our family together, to help us understand each other just like Thomas wanted." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of determination settle within him. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to honor his great-grandfather's legacy, and to fight for the love and understanding that Thomas and Margaret had dreamed of. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that it was worth it. As he looked out the window at the old oak tree, his branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, Jake felt a sense of hope. The journey ahead might be difficult, but he was ready to take it, one step at a time, with the memory of Thomas and Margaret guiding him every step of the way. Jake knew that if he wanted to honor the legacy of his great-grandfather Thomas and Margaret, he had to share their story with the rest of his family. He couldn't let this love, this bravery, stay buried in dusty letters in the attic. It was time for the truth to come out, and he was determined to be the one to do it. But he also knew that not everyone would be as open as his grandmother. He could already anticipate resistance, especially from his father, who had always been wary of digging into the past. One evening, after dinner, Jake gathered the courage to speak up. His family was sitting in the living room, his father watching TV, his mother flipping through a magazine, and his grandmother knitting as always. Jake cleared his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. "Can I talk to you all about something important?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. His father looked up, frowning. "What's going on, Jake?" he asked, turning off the TV. His mother set her magazine aside, and even his grandmother paused her knitting, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I've been learning about our family's history," he began, "about Great-Grandpa Thomas and Margaret. Grandma's been telling me about them, and I found some letters in the attic. I think it's important that we all know what really happened back then." His father's expression darkened almost immediately. "Jake, why are you digging up old stories?" he said, his tone sharp. "Those are things that were better left in the past. They're not something we need to be talking about now." Jake felt his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to continue. "I don't think it should be left in the past, Dad. Great-Grandpa Thomas and Margaret loved each other, but they couldn't be together because of the prejudice they faced. They were forced to give up what they had, and I think that's something we should remember. It's a part of who we are." His mother glanced at Jake, her eyes soft with understanding, but she remained silent. His grandmother nodded slightly, as if urging him to keep going, but his father's face grew even more tense. "Jake, you don't understand," his father said, his voice low and strained. "Those times were different. It was dangerous for people like Thomas and Margaret. Talking about it now, it doesn't change anything. It just brings up old wounds that don't need to be reopened." "But maybe it can change something," Jake argued, his voice gaining strength. "Maybe if we talk about it, we can understand each other better. We can learn from what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. Isn't that what Great-Grandpa Thomas would have wanted? For us to be better, to be more accepting?" His father shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It's not that simple, Jake. There are people out there who still don't want to see change. They don't want to hear about love between people who look different. And I don't want you getting hurt because of this." Jake's mother finally spoke up, her voice gentle. "Maybe Jake has a point, though," she said, looking at her husband. "Maybe it's time we face this part of our family's history instead of hiding from it. It's painful, yes, but it's also important. It's who we are." His father rubbed his face with his hands, clearly conflicted. Jake could see the worry in his eyes, the fear of what might happen if they brought this story out into the open. He knew his father only wanted to protect him, but Jake also knew that they couldn't keep pretending this part of their history didn't exist. "Dad, I know you're scared," Jake said, his voice softening, "but I'm not asking for us to go out and shout this from the rooftops. I just want us, as a family, to acknowledge what happened, to remember Thomas and Margaret, and to honor them. They couldn't be together because of the world they lived in, but we live in a different world now. We have a chance to make things right, even if it's just within our own family." There was a long silence. The tension in the room was almost palpable, and Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for his father's response. Finally, his father let out a long, weary sigh. He looked at Jake, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, love, sadness. "All right, Jake," he said quietly. "If this is really that important to you, then let's talk about it. But I want you to be careful. The world has changed, yes, but not enough. There are still people who won't understand, who won't accept it, and I don't want you to get hurt." Jake nodded, relief washing over him. "I understand, Dad. I'll be careful. I promise." His grandmother smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Thomas would be proud of you, Jake," she said softly. He wanted the world to be a better place, and you're helping make that happen." Jake felt the swell of emotion, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He looked at his family, his father, his mother, his grandmother, and he knew that this was only the beginning. There were still many conversations to be had, many wounds to heal, but they were taking the first step together. And that, he thought, was what mattered most. Over the next few days, Jake continued to talk to his family about Thomas and Margaret. His grandmother shared more stories, and his mother even found an old photo of Thomas, standing proudly beside the oak tree, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. Jake could see the love and hope that Thomas had carried, and it inspired him to keep pushing forward. But not everyone in the family was ready to accept the story. His father remained hesitant, and Jake's uncle, who lived in another town, was outright dismissive when he heard about it. "Why bring all that up now?" he had said during a family phone call. "It's not going to change anything, just let it be." Jake felt a pang of frustration, but he refused to back down. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, and that not everyone would be willing to face the truth. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. This was about more than just his family. It was about honoring the love that Thomas and Margaret had shared, and about making sure that their story wasn't forgotten. One evening, as Jake sat under the old oak tree, he thought about what his next step should be. He knew that he needed to do more than just talk to his family. He needed to find a way to share this story with others, to help people understand the pain and sacrifice that his great-grandfather and Margaret had gone through. He wanted to find a way to bring people together, to bridge the gap that had kept his family and so many others apart for so long. As he sat there, the wind rustling through the leaves above him, Jake made a decision. He was going to reach out to Margaret's descendants. He didn't know if they would be willing to talk to him or if they even knew about Thomas and Margaret, but he had to try. He had to take that step, not just for himself, but for Thomas and Margaret, and for the future that they had dreamed of. With renewed determination, Jake stood up and placed his hand on the rough bark of the old oak. "I won't let your story be forgotten," he whispered. "I'll find a way to bring us all together. I promise." The journey ahead was still uncertain, and Jake knew that there would be challenges and setbacks, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, and he had the memory of Thomas and Margaret guiding him. And as long as he held on to that, he knew he could face whatever lay ahead. Jake had made up his mind. He knew that if he truly wanted to honor the love story of his great-grandfather Thomas and Margaret, he had to reach out to Margaret's descendants. It was a daunting thought. He had no idea how they would react or even if they knew anything about Thomas. But something deep inside him told him that this was the right thing to do. He needed to bridge the gap, just as his great-grandfather had hoped all those years ago. The first step was finding them. Jake spent hours online searching for any leads that could connect him to Margaret's family. He knew her last name from the letters, but he wasn't sure if it had changed after she got married. He scoured genealogy websites, public records, and even social media, hoping to find a clue. It was a slow, frustrating process, but Jake was nothing if not determined. After days of searching, Jake finally stumbled upon an old obituary for Margaret. It listed her children and grandchildren, and he felt a spark of hope as he read through the names. One of her grandsons, a man named Peter, seemed like the best lead. He lived only a couple of towns over, and Jake managed to find his social media profile. His heart pounded as he typed out a message, unsure of how to start. "Hi, Peter. My name is Jake. I know this might sound strange, but I think our families are connected. My great-grandfather, Thomas, was very close to your grandmother, Margaret. I've been learning about their story, and I think it's important that our families connect. I would love to talk to you more if you're interested." Jake hit send, his hands trembling slightly. He knew it was a long shot. There was no guarantee that Peter would respond or even believe him, but he had to try. He had to take that step, no matter how uncertain it might be. Days passed, and Jake checked his messages obsessively. Each time he opened his phone, his heart would skip a beat, hoping for a response. He knew that this was a sensitive subject, and he tried to prepare himself for the possibility that Peter might not want anything to do with it. But the waiting was still agonizing. Finally, one afternoon, Jake saw a notification that made his heart leap into his throat. Peter had replied. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he opened the message. "Hi, Jake. I'll be honest, I was surprised to get your message. I don't know much about my grandmother's past, but I've heard bits and pieces over the years. If what you're saying is true, I'd really like to hear more. Maybe we could meet up and talk." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a smile spreading across his face. This was it, the first step toward building a bridge between their families. He quickly typed out a reply, suggesting they meet at a local coffee shop the following weekend. Peter agreed, and Jake felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He knew that this meeting could change everything, and he wanted to do it right. The day of the meeting, Jake arrived at the coffee shop early. He sat at a corner table, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say. He had brought the letters with him, carefully packed in a small box, along with a few old photographs of Thomas. He hoped that sharing these artifacts would help Peter understand the depth of the connection between their grandparents. A few minutes later, the door to the coffee shop opened, and Jake saw a man who looked to be in his early 40s walk in, his eyes scanning the room. Jake stood up, waving slightly. The man spotted him and approached the table, a cautious but friendly smile on his face. "Peter?" Jake asked, extending his hand. "Yeah, you must be Jake," Peter replied, shaking his hand firmly. He sat down, glancing at the box on the table. "I have to admit, I'm really curious about all of this. My family didn't talk much about Grandma Margaret's past. It was always kind of a mystery." Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "I get it. My family was the same way. It wasn't until recently that I started learning about my great-grandfather Thomas and his relationship with your grandmother. It's been an emotional journey, but I think it's important that we know the truth." Peter leaned forward, his eyes focused on Jake. "So tell me, what do you know about them?" Jake took a deep breath, opening the box and pulling out one of the letters. He handed it to Peter, watching as his expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, something almost reverent. Peter carefully unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. Jake could see the emotion in his face as he read, the weight of the story beginning to sink in. "They loved each other," Jake said softly, "but they couldn't be together because of the way the world was back then. My great-grandfather was a black man, and your grandmother was white. It was dangerous for them to be together, so they had to keep it a secret. They met under an old oak tree, the one in my backyard. That's where they shared their dreams, their hopes for a future where they could be together." Peter looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I had no idea," he whispered. "I knew there was something in her past, but she never talked about it. I always thought maybe it was too painful for her." Jake nodded. "It was the same for my family. but I think that by hiding their story, we're doing them a disservice. They loved each other, and that love mattered. It still matters. I think we have a chance to honor them by acknowledging what they went through, by bringing our families together." Peter was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands. Finally, he looked up at Jake, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're right," he said. "They deserve to be remembered. And maybe it's time our families stop being strangers." A sense of relief washed over Jake, and he smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. This was what he had hoped for, a chance to bridge the gap, to bring their families together, just as Thomas and Margaret had dreamed of. They spent the next hour talking, sharing what little they knew about their grandparents, piecing together the fragments of a love story that had been hidden for too long. By the end of their meeting, they had made a plan. Peter would talk to his family, share what he had learned, and Jake would do the same. They agreed to arrange a gathering, a chance for both families to come together, to meet under the old oak tree where it had all begun. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges, but they were both committed to making it happen. As they stood to leave, Peter reached out and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Thank you, Jake," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for reaching out. I think this is something Grandma Margaret would have wanted." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride and hope. "I think so too. And I think Great-Grandpa Thomas would be proud of us for doing this." They parted ways, and Jake left the coffee shop with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance and maybe even backlash, but he also knew that he was doing the right thing. He was honoring the love that had been carved into the old oak tree, and he was building the bridge that his great-grandfather had dreamed of. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of peace. He was no longer just a boy caught between two worlds. He was a bridge, a symbol of unity, and he was ready to carry that legacy forward. The day of the family meeting had finally arrived. Jake stood in the backyard looking up at the old oak tree that had been the silent witness to so many moments of love and longing. Today, it would witness something new, something that neither Thomas nor Margaret could have imagined in their time. It would witness the meeting of their families, a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Jake had spent the last few weeks preparing for this moment. He and Peter had worked together, sharing what they knew with their respective families, slowly helping them understand the importance of this gathering. There had been resistance. Some members of both families were still wary of digging up the past, afraid of what it might reveal. But there were others who were curious, who were willing to take that step forward to learn about the love that had once been hidden away. As Jake stood under the oak, he felt a mix of emotions, excitement, anxiety, and a deep sense of responsibility. He wanted everything to go well. He wanted this to be a moment of healing, a moment that would honor the legacy of Thomas and Margaret. He looked over to his grandmother, who was sitting on a chair near the tree, her eyes filled with a gentle, encouraging smile. She gave him a small nod as if to say, "You've got this." The sound of car doors closing caught Jake's attention, and he turned to see the first of Margaret's descendants arriving. Peter was there, along with his mother and a few other family members. They approached slowly, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward to greet them. "Hey, Peter," Jake said, extending his hand. "Hey, Jake," Peter replied, shaking his hand with a warm smile. He turned to introduce his family. "This is my mom, Karen, and my aunt, Linda." Jake greeted them, his heart pounding in his chest. He could sense the hesitation in their eyes, but there was also a warmth there, a willingness to be part of this moment. Jake led them to where his grandmother was sitting, and soon more members of his own family began to gather around the oak tree. His parents were there, along with his uncles, aunts, and cousins. The backyard, which had always felt like a private sanctuary, was now filled with people from two different worlds, brought together by a shared history. There was a moment of silence as everyone stood around the tree, unsure of how to begin. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken words and emotions that had been buried for so long. He knew that it was up to him to break the ice, to set the tone for what this meeting was meant to be. He cleared his throat, stepping closer to the tree. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I know this isn't easy. I know that for a lot of us, talking about the past can be painful. But I think it's important that we're here, that we're acknowledging what happened and honoring the people who came before us." Jake paused, his eyes drifting to the old oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. "This tree was a meeting place for my great-grandfather, Thomas, and Margaret. It was here that they came to be together, even when the world wouldn't allow it. They loved each other, but they had to keep that love hidden because of the way things were back then. They couldn't be together, but their love mattered. It still matters." He looked around at the gathered faces, some of them filled with emotion, others still guarded. Today, we're here to honor that love, to remember Thomas and Margaret, and to show that we're not afraid of their story. We're not afraid to acknowledge the past, and we're not afraid to take steps toward understanding each other. Peter stepped forward, his eyes meeting Jake's. "My grandmother never talked much about her past," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I always felt like there was something she carried with her, something that she never got to share. Learning about her love for Thomas and knowing that it meant so much to her makes me realize just how much she sacrificed. I think she would be proud to see us all here today, together." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest. He turned to his grandmother, who had tears in her eyes. She smiled at him, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "They would be so proud of you, Jake." With that, Jake and Peter led the group to the spot they had prepared beneath the oak tree. There, they had brought a young sapling, a symbol of new beginnings. Together, with the help of their families, they began to plant the new tree, digging into the earth with shovels, their hands working side by side. As they worked, the tension began to ease. People started talking, sharing stories, asking questions. Jake's mother spoke with Peter's aunt, the two of them exchanging memories of their parents and grandparents. Jake watched as his father, who had been so hesitant about this meeting, began to open up, talking with Peter about the challenges their families had faced. It was as if, in the act of planting this new tree, they were also planting the seeds of understanding, of a future where the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. When the tree was finally in the ground, Jake stood back, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked at the young sapling, its leaves trembling slightly in the breeze, and then at the old oak that towered above it. The contrast between the two trees, the old and the new, felt symbolic. The old oak carried the weight of the past, the memories of a love that had been hidden away. The young tree represented hope, growth, and the possibility of a different future. Jake turned to face the gathered families, his heart full. "This tree is a symbol of what we're doing here today," he said. "It's a symbol of growth, of change, and of the love that Thomas and Margaret shared. It's a reminder that we can be one if we find a way to understand each other." There was a moment of silence, and then, slowly, people began to clap. It was a gentle, heartfelt applause, and Jake felt tears welling in his eyes. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there was still much work to be done, still many conversations to be had. But this moment, this gathering under the oak tree, was a step forward. It was a chance to heal, to build bridges, and to honor the legacy of those who had come before them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the backyard, the family stayed together, talking, laughing, and sharing a meal. The old oak tree stood tall, its branches swaying gently above them, and the young sapling stood beside it, its roots just beginning to take hold in the earth. Jake looked around, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment. He knew that Thomas and Margaret would be proud of what they had started, that their love, though hidden for so long, had finally found its place in the light. Jake sat down beside his grandmother, who reached over and took his hand. "You did good today, Jake," she said softly. "You brought us all together. You honored their memory in the best way possible." Jake smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. Thank you for believing in me." She patted his hand, her eyes filled with love. "Thomas and Margaret would be so proud of you. You're the bridge they always hoped for." Jake looked up at the oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that there would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt and resistance. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, and he had the legacy of love that Thomas and Margaret had left behind. And as long as he held on to that, he knew he could face whatever lay ahead. The night sky slowly darkened, and the family stayed under the oak tree, their laughter and voices filling the air. It was a night of connection, of hope, and of love, a night that honored the past while looking forward to the future. And for Jake, it was the beginning of something beautiful, something that he knew would continue to grow, just like the young sapling they had planted that day. The days after the family gathering under the oak tree felt different. Jake could sense a shift, not only within his own family but also within himself. He had carried the weight of the past, the unspoken pain of his great-grandfather Thomas and Margaret, and now it felt as though a burden had been lifted. Their story had been shared, their love acknowledged, and for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he truly understood where he came from. He felt more connected to both sides of his heritage, and he knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. Word of the family gathering spread quickly through the small town. It was the kind of story that people couldn't help but talk about. A story of love, sacrifice, and hope that had endured through generations. Jake was surprised when he received a call from the local newspaper, asking if they could do an interview about the story of Thomas and Margaret. At first, he hesitated. This was a deeply personal story, one that belonged to his family. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was an opportunity to share a message of unity and understanding with others. The interview took place in Jake's backyard, with the old oak tree as the backdrop. The reporter, a kind woman named Emily, listened intently as Jake recounted the story of Thomas and Margaret, their love, their struggle, and the way they had been forced apart by the prejudices of their time. Jake spoke about the letters he had found, the words carved into the tree, and the way their families had finally come together to honor their legacy. Emily was visibly moved by the story, and when the article was published a few days later, Jake was overwhelmed by the response. People from all over the town, and even beyond, reached out to him, expressing their support and their admiration for the courage it had taken to share such a powerful story. Many people shared their own stories of love and sacrifice, stories of their ancestors who had faced similar challenges. Jake realized that Thomas and Margaret's story was not unique. There were countless others who had faced the same struggles, who had fought for love in a world that refused to accept it. The oak tree became a symbol for the community. People began visiting Jake's backyard, leaving small tokens, flowers, notes, even carved wooden hearts, as a tribute to Thomas and Margaret. The young sapling they had planted during the family gathering was thriving, its leaves reaching for the sky, a testament to the new beginning that Jake and Peter had hoped to create. It was a symbol of the love that had once been hidden but was now being celebrated openly, without fear or shame. One day, as Jake was sitting under the oak tree, he received a message from Peter. It was a photo of Margaret, smiling, with the caption, "She would have loved to see this." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the picture. He could see the kindness in her eyes, the same kindness that Thomas must have seen all those years ago. He knew that they had both dreamed of a world where their love could exist without barriers, and though they had not lived to see that world, their descendants were now building it, one step at a time. Jake decided to take things further. He reached out to the local high school, offering to speak to students about his family's story. He wanted young people to understand the importance of love, tolerance, and the courage it took to stand up against hatred. The school agreed, and soon Jake found himself standing in front of a classroom full of students, sharing the story of Thomas and Margaret. He spoke about the power of love to overcome even the deepest divides, and about the importance of understanding each other, even when it wasn't easy. The students listened with rapt attention, and after his talk, several of them approached Jake to thank him for sharing his story. One young girl, her eyes filled with tears, told him that her own parents were from different racial backgrounds, and that she had often struggled to feel accepted. "Hearing about your great-grandfather and Margaret makes me feel like I belong," she said softly. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. This was why he was doing this, so that others could feel seen, heard, and understood. The oak tree continued to be a gathering place, not just for Jake's family, but for the community. People held vigils there, celebrating love in all its forms, honoring those who had come before them and those who were still fighting for a better world. Jake's father, who had once been so hesitant to confront the past, began attending these gatherings, standing proudly beside his son. Jake could see the change in his father, the way he had begun to let go of the fear that had once held him back, the way he was finally embracing the fullness of their family's history. Jake's grandmother, who had been the first to share the story with him, watched with pride as her grandson took on the role of a bridge builder. "Your great-grandfather would be so proud of you," she told him one evening as they sat together under the oak tree. "He always believed in a better world, and you're helping to make that world a reality." Jake looked at the young sapling, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. He thought about Thomas and Margaret, about the love they had shared and the sacrifices they had made. He knew that their story was not just about the past. It was about the future, about the kind of world that he and others were working to create. A world where love could flourish, where people could understand and accept each other, no matter their differences. The old oak tree stood as a testament to the past, its branches reaching out like arms, embracing all who came to sit beneath it. And beside it, a young tree grew, a symbol of hope, of new beginnings, of the unity that was now taking root. Jake knew that the journey was far from over. There would still be challenges, still be people who refused to understand. But he also knew that as long as there were people willing to listen, to learn, and to love, there was hope. And that, he thought, was more than enough. Thank you for finishing this video. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share your opinion in the comments and hit the bell to stay updated. Also, check out the following videos. More amazing stories are waiting for you. Where are you watching this video? Write in the comments, we're interested to find out.